All right. Welcome, everybody, to the, eighth CJS Noon Lecture of the year. I'm Marcus Nornis. I teach Japanese cinema here in ALC and FTVM. I have some brief general announcements before we head into the lecture. The first is 2 weeks from now, we're going to have our final lecture in the Noon Lecture series of this semester with the Fantasies of Ito Michio with Tara Rodman. This one's co-sponsored with the Department of Dance, and it's going to be down in Weiser 555 and also, of course, on Zoom. Next month, we're having something very special. Get one of these. If you haven't already, there's going to be a benshi performance by Kataoka Ichiro, who did an artistic residency here some years ago. For those of you who don't know, the benshi is the screenside narrator that would stand next to the movie screen and narrate the film, including imitating all the voices. And this one is going to be particularly special because we're showing very unusual and fascinating films. The first film, Viewing Maple Leaves, is the earliest extant film in Japanese cinema from 1899, and it features two of the greatest kabuki actors of the era. The second, Oath of the Sword, is the earliest extant Japanese-American film. It was shot in California. It starred Abe Yutaka, who would go on to make big. He'd become a major director in Japan in World War II and afterwards. Dull Sword, early animation by this great, very unknown animation master. And then Jiraiya, the hero, stars Medama Matsunosuke, Ono Matsunosuke, who was the first big star of Japanese cinema. And as you can, you'll see the images of a frog. It has amazing special effects. And then blood-spattered Takara no Baba. It's a bad translation of the Japanese title, Chi Kemuri Takara no Baba. It's a mist of blood over Takara no Baba. And it's the film version by Bansuma of a famous segment of Chushingura featuring Yasube the drunk. And then finally, A Straightforward Boy, which is, I believe it's the earliest extant ozu film. So we end with a comedy. But each one of these moves through the history of Japanese cinema. And over the course of the night, you'll see the transformation in Japanese cinematic narration, particularly the gestures and the performance, the transformations in performance styles from the beginning of cinema to the end of the silent era. So I hope you'll come. Arwolf, a famous fixture in Ann Arbor local culture, will be playing DJ for us, drawing on his vast archive along with WCBO's film record collection. Let's see. Also, for those who are attending the webinar, webcams and microphones are muted right now, but you can use the Q&A function to submit any kind of questions you have, and we'll get to them. There's a live transcription feature, i.e. closed captions. It's enabled on Zoom. If you don't want the captions, you can turn it off with a button down in the right corner. Look at the CJS events page, and you'll find more events coming. So today I want to introduce you to Kirsten Seuffert. She is our postdoctoral fellow for the Center of Japanese Studies. When I heard that the executive committee of CJS picked her, I was so happy because I was excited to have a kindred spirit here on campus. We're kindred spirits both because we do Japanese cinema, but our main interests overlap in so many ways, both in terms of period, genre, and probably attitude as well in many ways. Although I don't show it as much. So, Kirsten went to USC, where she was in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, but worked with people in other departments as well, including Akira Lippert, one of the great film scholars of Japanese cinema. And she got before that, she got a master's degree at Penn, And she's, since that time until the present, she's been doing a lot of research on cinema, gender, sexuality, subcultures, and things like that. And she's concentrating on the later 70s and into the 80s. That's, I suspect, what we're going to be hearing about today, which is a very interesting time because it's in the wake of basically the implosion of the political left. She has all these interests in performance, authorship, media history, affect. We've been having some very productive conversations about pro wrestling in the wake of Trump's triumph at the voting booth. And I really look forward to this lecture on other punks. Please welcome Kirsten.
Thank you, Marcus. That was very kind. And thank you all for coming today and braving the snow. I've been told I was Ame Onna before, but I guess I'm Yuki Onna now, so just because I'm in Michigan. But I'd like to thank the Center for Japanese Studies for having me here today, and I'd especially like to thank the CJS staff for making this speaker series happen. So thank you very much for your hard work. I'm honored to be part of this year's lineup. And I'd like to start today with just a short poll, just to sort of gauge familiarity. So first of all, how many of you listen to some type of Japanese music produced maybe after the 50s? Any kind of music? Put them up. Oh, excellent, big number. And next, how many of you listen to music produced in Japan that could possibly be classified as punk? And let's keep that loosely defined. Oh, good number. Wow, awesome. Next, how many of you have seen a fictional film produced in Japan where punk music and culture are represented? You know, maybe a character is a punk or punk music is in the soundtrack. Excellent, that's a great number. And lastly, how many of you have seen a documentary film produced in Japan that focuses on local punk music and musicians? Oh, I have one. This is good. All right. So not so many. I'm not surprised, but I'm also not discouraged because getting prodded out of our comfort zones is part of the fun of talks like these, right? But what I really want to stress is that, you know, even when we're talking about things like popular culture and subcultures and less mainstream materials, we can still find through lines, you know, to other topics and disciplines. And today, for instance, I'll be talking about things like gender, embodied experience, the materiality of culture, and also how we write histories, who writes histories, and, you know, whom or what gets left out, right? And I think these are important things to keep in mind as we're navigating our current cultural and intellectual climate, and they're also some of the key concerns that animate my research. So my presentation today stems from a chapter in my book manuscript in progress, and a truncated version was accepted for publication with the Journal of Cinema and Media Studies, but it's still, for many reasons, a work in progress. I'm still finding new materials every day and incorporating them, so I'm looking forward to your comments. But for this particular project, I'm taking a close look at works of cinema and other media produced in Japan in the later 70s and 80s. And by doing so, I'm going to attempt to do two things. And I'll just briefly mention that this is a period that, comparatively speaking, doesn't get a lot of focused attention within scholarship on Japanese film, either in Japanese or English. And this is one of the things that initially drew me to the project. But first, I traced the intersections of mainly film, but also other media like television, photography, manga, and print materials, and popular performance with subcultures active in Japan at this moment, with punk subcultures being the example I'll focus on today. No wrestling today, Marcus, I'm sorry. And second, I attempt to shed light on women's participation both within these subcultures and within the production of films, manga, photographs, and minikomi, or zines, and other works as well as the discourse surrounding them. So today I'm going to be focusing on the spaces where filmmaking and image making in Japan intersect with its punk subcultures, and also on how women helped co-create these spheres from the later 70s on. Or to cite Jack Halberstam, we can say that what I'm interested in are punk's quote-unquote queer edges in this context. And Halberstam has written that, quote, "The project of subcultural historiography demands that we look at the silences, the gaps, and the ruptures in the spaces of performance, and that we use them to tell disorderly narratives," unquote. And one of the things my talk will argue is that women's image making, performance, and authorship within Japan's subcultures during the 70s and 80s represents just such a gap, and that by filling this gap, we can lend diversity and inclusivity to existing histories of Japan's media and culture. Okay. So just one important thing to point out about cinema in Japan during the 70s and 80s is that comparatively few women were making films in this moment, particularly within the major film studio system, but also within independent filmmaking, be it dramatic film, experimental, documentary, what have you. And this absence is all the more glaring when we think about the fact that the 70s, early 70s saw the rise of Japan's women's liberation movement, and the 80s was a high point for feminism in terms of cultural, political, and intellectual visibility. But in terms of gender equality, as we know, on-the-ground progress was and is still quite slow in Japan as elsewhere. And there were exceptions, of course. You know, some women broke through and were successful in getting films made in various production settings, but the general situation was that due to social and industrial factors, directing remained a role comparatively few women occupied until maybe the 90s. But excavating the work of female filmmakers and other underrepresented voices within Japan's film history is therefore a critical necessity. And it feels to me like the situation is improving somewhat in recent years, and this is thanks to efforts by scholars, critics, and film programmers, a lot of people. And I'll just mention quickly that this year's Tokyo International Film Festival, which CJS's own Toyota visiting professor Ishizaka Kenji is central in organizing, included a section this year devoted to women's empowerment. So this is a positive step, and hopefully we'll see more like it. But nonetheless, you know, one of the arguments my project wants to make is that if we want to move beyond this rhetoric of very few women filmmakers and shed more historical light on women producing films and visual culture, two things would be productive. And first is deprivileging the role of director a bit and paying more critical attention to other quote-unquote non-elite roles like producer, scriptwriter, art director, makeup, etc. And scholars and organizations in Japan and elsewhere are already working on excavating these roles. For example, the Women Pioneers in Japanese Film Project, which is a very important resource. But of course, this is an ongoing effort and more work needs to be done. And the second, I feel there's a lot to be gained by branching out to include other media that share cinema's mediascapes, right? Because people don't create, consume, or write about film in isolation. My project seeks to loop in other media and modes of creation and performance. And in this, I take a cue from Gilles Deleuze, who writes that, quote, "It is at the level of the interference of many practices that things happen, beings, images, concepts, all the kinds of events," unquote. And I found Deleuze's concept of interference productive in terms of thinking about things like gender, tensions and synergies between media industries, cross-media collaboration, and the writing of criticism and history. So I should just quickly mention that the reason I have punk in quotation marks in the title of my talk is that I consider punk as a category or as a genre to be unstable, much like gender categories like woman, right? So both of these terms mean different things to different people, and they're performed and actualized in loose and individualized ways. So just to be clear from the outset, I don't want to identify anything like a punk film genre, for example, based on aspects like style. These things shift with specific time and geographical and cultural locations. So what I'm doing is I look at films and photos and other content that either document or cite punk subcultures and subcultural participation in Japan with a good degree of attention paid to documentary works. And sort of the idea of trying to define punk in certain situations has become a bit of a joke, in certain circles. And to illustrate this in the Japanese context, I'll show you just a quick bit from the trailer for this upcoming film, Zagisui Dozu, or The Sewers, which was written and directed by Ugana Kenichi. And this film opens in 2025. So it's a little bit from the trailer.
花子さん、あなたにとってパンクとは何ですか？
私にとってパンクはこのお味噌汁のようなものです。お味噌汁。
All right, so that's about as clear of a definition as you're going to get out of me today. But as I mentioned, this is a work in progress, so I can't wait to see this film. But this is partly due to this material being very difficult to locate. Archives don't tend to collect it. A lot was discarded in the moment. And in many cases, you have to purchase it, which is really expensive and often can't be done outside of Japan. And it's also been my experience that filmmakers, et cetera, tend to downplay this material's historical importance, and they don't release it, or else it gets parceled out in obscure places like music box sets and DVD bonus material. And I once got into this bidding war on Yahoo Auction over a 16-disc music box set of a band whose music I just don't even like, just because I needed this one bonus documentary film and I had to spend way too many research dollars on it. But here, access, is an issue. Access to funding, to the time and physical ability to go to Japan, language ability, et cetera. So not everyone can undertake this sort of research, but for me, this is more of an impetus to keep collecting these materials so that the diversity of this particular archive of images doesn't get lost. All right. So given these considerations, it's perhaps not surprising that there hasn't been a lot of scholarly dialogue that links the words Japan, cinema, and punk, either in Japanese or English. But some examples of existing work in English are critical writing on the now-defunct website Midnight Eye, particularly work by Tom Mess, and recent work by Mark Player. So Mess and Player make valuable contributions to histories of cross-media collaboration in Japan by sort of identifying intermixing within film and punk music scenes from the early 80s through the 90s and beyond. But while this critical work is sparse, I've noticed that when these conversations do happen, they tend to gravitate towards two nodes. And the first, they often center on the early work of the director Ishii Sōgo, who goes by the name Ishii Gakuryū now, and also his sphere of influence, which is often said to include the director Tsukumoto Shinya. But in particular, Ishii's 1982 dramatic film Bakuretsu Toshi, Burst City, has really become cemented in media history as the definitive punk film in this context. How many people have seen Burst City? Wow, not so many. That's surprising, but you should watch it. It's a really good film, actually. But some reasons given for this are Ishii's embedding of musical performances by actual punk bands like the Stalin and the Rockers in the film, his use of sort of a visceral visual and oral style, and his inclusion of documentary-like scenes involving punk band members who were in the cast. And Ishii also made concert films and videos for bands like the Stalin and Anarchy, so this also lends weight to the emphasis. But this suturing of Ishii to punk has occurred despite what I consider the eclecticism of his early to late 70s and 80s works, and as well as the diverse subcultures that are represented in them. In these films, you'll find yakuza, furyo, or delinquent culture, bosozoku, or motorcycle and street racing culture. There's professional wrestling. You'll get extreme nationalists, and even everyday student culture. So a lot of this linkage between Ishii and punk has happened more recently in critical and consumer spaces. For example, you can see here the 2006 DVD box set, Ishii Sōgo, Punk Years, 1976 to 83, which kind of helps construct Ishii as Japan's foremost punk director. It packages 6 of his early films as expressions of quote-unquote rage and punk spirit, even though Burst City isn't included in the box. But what the box does is it constructs Ishii's films as a punk monolith, which in my opinion homogenizes his filmmaking as well as the subcultures that it cites. Mess, for instance, has argued that, quote, filmed documents of the Japanese punk scene of the late 70s and early 80s are rare items indeed, unquote, yet he adds that, quote unquote, nearly all existing documents can be attributed to Ishii. And while I do agree with Mess that these films are indeed limited and they remain unknown to many viewers and critics, in actuality, they're not quite as rare as existing scholarship suggests. So I am arguing for sort of a shift away from Ishii's gravitational pull, but I do at the same time acknowledge, that his works contribute significantly to cultural production at the intersection of film, music, and punk culture and performance. And, he has been influential on a lot of filmmakers in terms of going out and getting your own films made. And he even identifies sometimes with the label punk director, but whether this is sometimes feels facetious or, a little bit like a construction after the fact, but that's up for debate. But nonetheless, the point that I'd like to make is that by exploring other punk-adjacent films circulating in this context that scholarship has thus far neglected, in particular documentary works and those centered on female performance and authorship, we can start to build a richer, more inclusive image of Japan's punk subculture and their mediation. And second, analyses that link film in Japan to punk have emphasized a boom in what's called jishu eiga, or autonomous film, that was gaining momentum in later 70s to 80s Japan, or in other words, DIY filmmaking. And there's a lot of nuance to this that I don't have time to go into today, but just as a historical aside, the boom was aided by technological innovations in filmmaking equipment like lighter, smaller cameras, and it can also be linked to more women trying their hand at cinema. But by now, the fusing of like a DIY practice and so-called punk media in many contexts is by now an established critical mode, particularly when we're talking about music or visual artistic practice. And certainly there were image makers who did identify with the punk label in Japan at the time, who were experimenting with DIY forms of aesthetics, production, distribution, and exhibition. But the point that I'd like to make is that overemphasizing the connection between jishu eiga and sort of a generalized punk-inflected DIY mode in this context, which I do feel certain scholars do, can be problematic in several ways. First, it glosses over a long and vibrant history of independent filmmaking and image making in Japan that predates punk. And it also downplays other production modes like punk-related major studio efforts and films produced by major record labels. And another important consideration is the fact that sort of a DIY ethos was practiced within media other than music and cinema in Japan's post-war period, for example, in the production of manga and minikomi. And here I have on the bottom right, one of the minikomi that was sort of central to organizations within Japan's women's liberation movement in early 1970s. So a very important precedent there. And we can also see this history and work on jishu eiga and manga dojinshi, or peer-produced manga by Alexander Zalton. So when we look at, sort of individual films and we start to pay attention to jishu eiga's industrial specificities, it becomes difficult to sort of support a reading of jishu and punk as synonymous. And I personally choose to read jishu eiga and punk as modes of creation, exhibition, and distribution that do share a degree of temporal and practical overlap, yet at the same time possess their own histories and contingencies that we don't want to distill down to, a shared DIY spirit or anti-authoritarian impulse. So basically, I want to create a little bit more space between these two terms than I feel currently exists in dialogue surrounding film in Japan. But these sorts of linkages also extend beyond scholarship to the connected realm of film programming. For example, in 2022, New York's Metrograph exhibited some rarely screened 8mm films produced in Japan from the late 70s to 1990 in a series titled Hachimiri Madness, or 8mm Madness, Japanese indies from the punk years. And according to Metrograph's website, the series chose jishu eiga films that constituted, quote, a rude burst of amateur cinematic anarchy, unquote, characterized by anti-authoritarian rage. And the problem I have with the series is that it links a range of characteristics that have become sedimented over time as a universal sort of punk attitude, style, or politics, anarchy, rage, anti-authoritarianism, DIY, to distinctive films that have complex aesthetics, themes, and production histories. And this labeling perhaps stems from a common tendency to view punk, understood as a global movement, as what Lawrence Grossberg has termed a watershed of some sort. Punk happened and nothing was the same after that. So for me, these films don't fit easily within a constructed boundaries of a quote-unquote punk years or punk era of filmmaking in Japan. And moreover, considering that the idea for this series originated outside Japan at the 2016 Berlin and Hong Kong International Film Festivals, it's crucial to point out that a sort of Orientalist gaze can hover around these curatorial impulses. I was told by the PIA Film Festival that although they co-curated the series with Berlin and Hong Kong, they themselves didn't come up with the punk concept, so that came from Berlin and Hong Kong. So because these intersecting conversations about film and punk in Japan are happening, right, within scholarship, exhibition, and media marketing, I feel it's valuable to sort of address it, to address this discourse before it really has a chance to solidify. So before I move on, I just want to riff a little bit about punk culture in Japan and fandom. There's a sort of cult visibility to punk music and punk-related films produced in Japan, and this is true in the domestic sense, but even more so in terms of international appeal. And I think part of this idea is, or part of this is an idea that aspects of Japanese culture are, extreme, or they're just more in some way, more violent, more shocking, more visually and aurally stimulating. And because these sorts of images of Japan can start to take on an Orientalist or even techno-Orientalist flavor, I try to keep an eye out for them in my research, and I also try to avoid reproducing them in my own work as much as possible. So it's for this reason that I'm trying to disturb the conversation a little bit and consider other ways that we can engage the spaces where cinema and visual culture in Japan overlap with punk, and more specifically because the majority of films that are discussed and screened in these conversations tend to be directed by men and to star male actors. For example, Burst City, I want to focus on things like gender, performance, and authorship. Gender and other forms of embodied identity like sexuality, ethnicity, disability tend to be muted in scholarship and criticism on punk-related film in Japan. But one of the things that I'm trying to demonstrate in my work is that by utilizing alternative frameworks, we can illuminate other ways in which punk has been embodied, expressed, and mediated in this context. So with that, I'm going to end the more soapboxy portion of my talk and move on a little bit. So you're probably wondering, what did you find in your research? So ultimately what I discovered was really a more vibrant archive of images than scholarship and criticism typically acknowledge. So my argument then is that within Japan's late 70s and 80s quote-unquote punk visual culture, a meaningful diversity existed in terms of things like media utilized, genre, representation, themes, authorship, and performance. And that one of the things that I'd like to stress today is the significance of documentary forms to histories of media and punk culture in this context. In other words, directors and image makers like photographers capturing various active punk scenes via documentary practice, be it documentary film, concert film, and video or photography. And this might seem like a no-brainer, right? But documentary films, for instance, in this context, receive very little critical attention compared to dramatic films like Burst City, even though they did emerge during the formational period of punk culture in Japan. And they do play key roles at the intersection of film music, filmmaking music, and fandom. So to me, these films, along with the other content I discuss, are significant in that they highlight women's contributions to Japan's punk subcultures, which both dramatic films and media histories tend to marginalize. So in the late 70s and 80s in Japan, like everywhere else, women were helping shape punk scenes and their attendant media as image makers, performers, critics, and fans. So I just want to argue that channeling critical attention towards documentary works and works centered on female authorship and performance can sort of yield a fuller picture of this sociocultural and media environment. So today I'm focusing on one film and several texts that orbit around it, and this is the 1984 documentary Chotto no ame rara gaman, or Never Mind a Little Rain, which was directed and shot in 8mm by Yasuda Junji, and hereafter I'll refer to this film as Chotto. So what Chotto does is capture in raw form the early days of hardcore punk in Japan, and it showcases performances by and interviews with members of bands like Gizmu, Gaze, Zelda, The Comes, and even Ishii Sōgo's short-lived band, Basilisk Army Project. But despite its status as a self-produced and self-distributed work with deep connections to independent music and filmmaking, this film is rarely discussed in scholarship, but there's one very good reason for this, and that's Chotto is really hard to access. Chotto screened on and off in theaters and music clubs or live houses in Japan from 1984 to 1994, but then it was yanked from exhibition until 2018, so more than 20 years, right? And then in 2018, it reappeared at limited locations and as part of a multimedia event centered on Yasuda on the streaming platform Damyun. But as yet, Chotto hasn't been released on DVD, and no such plans appear in the works. So accordingly, it enjoys a legendary status as a quote-unquote unscreenable film, and the term that's often used to talk about this film is joe fukano, like you cannot screen this film, right? So in 2019, it went back on the shelf, and it remained dormant until 2022 when it was screened as a one-off with Yasuda's latest music documentary. And I was lucky enough to catch this screening. There's a picture of the screening door in the middle there. And then there was one screening in January 2023 that followed as a part of a series honoring the director Otsubo Sojiro, who passed away in 2020. Yasuda and Otsubo formed what they call Punk Moving Image Label PPP project together in 1984, and both have directed many music films and videos since. And Otsubo himself made a 1985 concert film titled Ora Aurora, or Ara Aurora, on 8mm that sort of similarly captures mid-'80s punk bands and performances, and it also is very rarely screened. But they both might eventually see wider re-release and expansion to DVD, but for now they share an ephemerality, right, that's been the fate of many films and performances from this era. And when I asked Yasuda about this, he said, you know, he made Chotto when he was young and unskilled. These were his words, not mine. He was embarrassed to show it, and he said a lot of his personal feelings went into it, so he just didn't really want it out there. But I understand, you know, his feeling, but nonetheless, I think this ephemerality is regrettable for two reasons. And first is that Chotto evidences the significance of documentary forms to Japan's, you know, quote-unquote punk visual archive. And second, it highlights the under-acknowledged positions that women occupied at the forefront of punk music, image making, and criticism. But going back even before 1983, there was already a dialogue happening surrounding documentary film and punk in Japan, and this wasn't a conversation happening in film journals or mainstream magazines, but happening on theater screens, in live houses, which were being used as screening spaces, and in subcultural magazines like Takarajima and Doll, and also in Minikomi. And it was a conversation sort of flowing between the bodies attending screenings who actually had a chance to experience physically, you know, performances and music that they might not otherwise have had a chance to see, hear, or feel. And on the left here is a flyer taken from Doll magazine for Tokyo Last, which was a New Year's 80-81 event held at Shinjuku's ACB Hall. There were performances by bands of different genres like the Stalin, Esken, Jagatara, and Hadaka no Rarizu. There was dancing, and they had screenings of films and videos featuring bands like the Sex Pistols, The Clash, PIL, and Talking Heads. So for me, what Tokyo Last's eclecticism demonstrates is that even before Ishii's Burst City, punk music, film, and video, as well as film going and gig going, were intermixing in Japan. And granted, many of the videos screened in these series were imported from abroad and featured bands from London, New York, et cetera, but they nonetheless contributed to the formation of a sense that to do punk was to immerse oneself in a lived multimedia environment. And you can see on the bottom right here, I also found some ads for similar screening gig combos for reggae videos as well. So I think it's important to point out that punk didn't really have a monopoly on these sorts of multimedia events at the time. And of course, there were multimedia precedents that we could cite as well. But even before the 80s, documentary film in Japan intersected with punk. The film Rokazu, or Rockers, directed by Tsushima Hideaki in 1979 on 16mm, documents the heyday of the Tokyo Rockers, which was sort of a loose grouping of bands that the media subsumed under the term, often considered, proto-punk in Japan. The film featured performances by bands like Lizard, Friction, and Mr. Kite, which you see pictured here. And so it is, in terms of subject matter and soundtrack, a seminal work of local punk filmmaking in Japan. Its early existence demonstrates the significance of not only things like concert films and music videos, but also other documentary forms to Japan's punk media histories, whether independently produced and exhibited or otherwise. Rockers screened at Image Forum in 1979, and bands like the all-girl group Boys Boys performed its screening. Minikomi covered its release, and it really became a generative site of cross-media dialogue. It has dynamic performance footage and also candid interviews, so it lets people sort of experience the atmospheres of clubs that are legendary now, like Shimokitazawa Loft and Yane Ura, and then people could sort of sense for themselves the intensity and intimacy and physicality of going to a live gig. So in 1970s to 80s Japan, we can see that, filmmakers, musicians, club managers, record shop owners, film programmers, magazine and mini-komi writers, and fans were really co-creating this environment, which then grew and started to evolve. But we can also look at Chotto, which is the film I want to talk about today, as sort of a rich source of multisensorial experience. The film captures the vitality and diversity of its band's performances, but then interviews that are woven throughout also let musicians share more personal views on, life and what punk means to them, or in a lot of cases doesn't mean to them in this case. But in early 80s Japan, distribution of independently produced hardcore records wasn't really set up, and not a lot of these bands were touring. So Chotto exposed audiences to these sounds and images, which is a situation that holds true now that many of these bands are defunct. And via sort of the gig footage and the interview scenes, audiences also can gain access to what we could call punk spaces, right? The stages, the venue floors, the backstage corners, but also everyday spaces like streets, parks, cafes, and private homes. And earlier Rockers also sort of incorporates an everyday, embodied everydayness. For example, it follows one musician around on his day job, driving a taxi, and then others are complaining about being really exhausted after their gigs. And, as in all documentary, these scenes are performative, but what they do is they enable audiences to sort of imagine punk's off moments, right, which are de-intensified moments that drama films tend to eschew. So as such, these documentaries that vacillate between visceral music performance and sort of the mundane punk everyday extend a wide range of lived punk experiences, right? So for me, certain of these documentaries are valuable in that they allow us to access, or at least to start to imagine, the punk every day, right? Which includes the way in which things like gender factor into it. But we can also start to think about the practice of documenting punk as also deeply corporeal. For example, Yasuda talked about, really feeling tension and loss of control when he was embedded in these hardcore crowds, and then adrenaline and a sense of risk when violence would break out. But similar feelings of, volatility and stimulation can also be found in Nihongi Satomi's 1979 photo book, Punk Rock in London, documentary 77 to 79, which showcases late 70s images shot at gigs throughout London, and Nihongi was embedded there like Yasuda was in early 80s Japan. Like Chotto, Nihongi's work incorporates an everyday component here via inclusion of her personal diary. And her diary entries follow kind of a fractured form, like much like Yasuda's composition of short bursts of interviews and performances. But her protagonist, which is herself, remains constant, right? But both of these works, Choto and Nihongi's work, depict punk experiences as integral to their protagonists' lived every day, right? They're performing, they're creating, they're attending shows and consuming media. And as do the subjects in Choto, Nihongi shares her embodied punk experiences, right? She uses her images and her text to document intimate details of the performances, the club spaces, sort of the atmospheres in them, the geography of punk London, how much a kebab costs in Japanese yen, that sort of thing, crowd fashions and behaviors and, physical sensations. So her images and writing reveal these punk spaces and lifestyles in this context as filtered through her personal perspective. And in this sense, the book is really significant in that it represents a unique contribution to transnational exchange of punk images and criticism. So here we have a female photographer from Japan contributing to the global punk visual archive, and that proves that the flow of images wasn't one way, right, outside of Japan into Japan, and also that women in Japan were active in the subculture. And one interesting aspect of this photo book for me is that in her diary, Nihongi writes that for her photographic images and words were inadequate to sort of describe these punk sounds and sensations she was experiencing, like intense volume and speed. So this kind of hints at a perceived limitation of the media she chose and, maybe even cinema's potential to intervene here. But for me, what's particularly significant for media histories is the fact that both Choto and Nihongi's work demonstrate women's interventions, not only within late 70s to 80s punk music across the globe, but also within Japan's, quote-unquote punk visual culture. Because both of them document scenes rather than focusing on one band like some films and videos do, they accommodate more bodies, right? And they provide a wider cultural snapshot. So via photos of and notes on gender diverse and sexually diverse artists and fans and her own involvement in London scenes, Nihongi both documents and reflects punk heterogeneity that's also being found in places like New York and Tokyo at this time. And you can also see this diversity in the work of photographers Chibiki Yuichi and Sato Gin, who were also documenting Japan's 70s to 80s punk subcultures. And this diversity surfaces within film in Japan as early as Rockers in 1979 via embedded performance by the band Mr. Kite, which was fronted by the vocalist Jean, also known as Misaka Emiko. And then later Choto incorporates multiple female voices by integrating performers like Sayoko from Zelda, Gizm's Mario, Hidemaru from Gaze, and Chitose from the Kams. And then Ara Aurora also spotlights the bassist Yuko from Arerugi. But for me, what films like Choto, Rockers, and Ara Aurora do is they render female punk participation visible and audible, which is a gesture of anti-effacement that marks documentary film in this context as historically significant. And further, these films are shedding light on the way that women in these subcultures are living and performing and how these behaviors and choices differ or not from contemporary social norms regarding, quote unquote, female bodies and behavior and appearance. So to put it simply, in my estimation, these films are valuable in that they demonstrate in this moment in Japan, like everywhere else, punk was affecting women's lives and they were affecting it back. So I think it's valuable. And I'm going to show you just a couple clips. The first are two clips fused together from the film Rockers, showing Mr. Kite and Jean. And the second is just a little bit from the trailer for Ara Aurora.
したらすごいなんか驚きとかなんかいろんなさ感情がさあってさ、でなんでそんなに驚くのか今でも思ってる。何言ったらいなかったよ私。お酒は飲んでたけどね。でもたまにやってたけどね。何でも同じだったんだよ。お酒もさ、薬もさ、みんな同じだった。違う、私は田舎が嫌いだからね。そこには白い骨が Oh, racing
Now just from the trailer for Our Aurora. These films are really great to see in the theater because they usually set up like a really crazy speaker system in the corner to do what they call like bakuon joy, or like explosive sound. So it takes some doing to sit through it sometimes. But getting back to Choto, what's even more significant for me than the fact that it includes female musicians is its centering of both a female narrator, the actor Nami, and interviewer Tohara Rie. Nami's questioning of what punk is becomes a key conceptual framework for the film, but Tohara-san was indispensable to Choto. She functioned as co-producer, she co-wrote the narration with Yasuda, and she shouldered the on-screen interviewing labor. So Choto is, as such, a punk-related film in which women have high visibility as filmmakers, and this is really uncommon in Japan at this time. Of course, there were people of diverse gender identity behind the scenes helping out on these films in various capacities, but Choto is unique in that it overtly inscribes women within Japan's punk media, and again, this is a visibility that's often missing from works that garner more critical and popular attention. And finally, I'm going to show you some footage from Choto, and I'm going to have to show you the trailer. And the reason why I can only show you the trailer is that Yasuda-san asked me to never, ever, ever, ever show anybody in any situation this film. He's very possessive of it, so I can't show you anything other than the publicly released trailer, but hopefully you'll understand what I'm talking about from seeing some of these.
その黒い服の女の子はおさげの上に帽子をちょこんと乗せて口を丸く大きく開けて歌っていました。畜生畜生何にも見えないというその言葉が私には痛いほどよくわかりました。何も変わらないけれどそれからさてどうしようというのが私にとってのパンクでした。まだ何も見えませんか？何も変わっていませんか？退屈ですか？好きな人はいますか？取り急ぎ地上界の話まで。
Okay. So from seeing that, I hope you can start to understand how excited I was when I saw this film to see how prominent women were in the production of this film. And I wasn't able to get that much information from Yasuda-san about Tohara Rie. He said he lost touch with her, but that maybe she was living in the US. But I really wanted to get in touch with her, so I did a Google search, and I found a Tohara Rie about the right age in living in America, so I sent her a letter. And I was a little worried that it was like a little bit stalkery, right, to... You know, now it's kind of strange when we receive a letter in the mailbox from someone who knows where we live. So email's a little bit better, right? But I put it on the university letterhead and I typed it out. And it took a while, but one day I got a response, and it was Tohara-san from Choto. And since then, we've been emailing back and forth, and she's sharing some really great stuff with me about the making of this film. And I don't have time to mention everything, but I'll just share a few things. Tohara-san told me that she met Yasuda when they were both students at the Japan Institute for the Moving Image, where Ishizaka sensei is provost, so it's a very small film world, right? And she said they made Choto together as their graduation project. She said they were the only people in the whole film school that were interested in this sort of music, and they both loved punk as much as they loved film, so it was a natural connection. And when I asked her, she also said she didn't really know of any other women sort of working on punk-related film in this context. So if that's the case, this really makes her contribution to Choto unique. After graduation, Tohara-san produced a fiction film for Yasuda. She worked with the Pia Film Festival, and she worked as publicist for the director Tsukamoto Shinya. She's not involved in film production now, but she loves cinema still, and I'm getting so much out of talking to her and hearing about what it was like to make films and go to gigs in Japan at this time. But one of the most interesting things that Tohara-san told me was that because when she was making Choto, she didn't really worry about logical consistency when she was asking interview questions, and because she asked about a lot of things that don't have anything to do with music, you know, she was able to really draw a lot of things out of the musicians and sort of capture in a really raw way what was happening at the time, at least, you know, for these individuals. So for me, this is one of the most compelling aspects of the film. Okay. And Tohara-san also told me she was a big fan of the all-girl band Zelda, who appear in Choto. I have the feeling that Tohara-san is the reason why Zelda is in Choto, but Zelda's music was really influential in Japan in the creative and media circles at this time. For example, Yasuda was influenced by them. So their inclusion in Choto argues for both gender diversity and music genre diversity within the punk mediascape. I think a lot of what people would say, oh, they're not punk, why are they in there? But as you can tell, I think those sorts of questions are kind of pointless. But here I also want to suggest as a key contribution the music writing and publication labor of Kojima Sachiho, who was Zelda's leader and bassist. In 1979, Kojima founded the mini-komi Change 2000, which served as a really potent critical voice in Japan's music and media scenes. Kojima writes that for her, creating and having a release valve like making music and writing for change were really indispensable life strategies. She started a mini-komi because she was feeling what she called a sense of powerlessness, that bands in Japan had no quote-unquote effective media at their disposal. So she's really an example of someone who's really affecting media discourse, you know, on the independent level at the time. And I haven't been able to get my hands on more than 4 copies of Change. They're rare and they're really expensive when you can find them. But for now, I found some interesting things like a report on the film Rockers, film concerts or filmu concerto being planned, and also this interview with the videographer Kanezawa Rieko from Video Gallery Scan. Kanezawa-san was also going out and like making video recordings of bands performing at the time, not necessarily punk bands, but she's also contributing to the environment. So I'm going through Change and I'm looking for things like crossover between film and video, music and live performance, and of course I'm looking for contributions by women to these scenes. And both of these so far seem to really be a priority for Change's editors. And in addition to mini-komi, music gig and film screening flyers or chirashi are other sources of information that I'm looking into. And many of these have long since been relegated to the trash heap, but fortunately some people held on to them. So from just a very cursory look, I've found evidence of things like all-female music gigs and events that mix live music with film and video screenings. And on the top right, you can see Change 2000 organizing sort of a film music crossover. So I need to find more of these, so stay tuned for that. But sort of these materials bring me to my last topic, which is ephemerality. So unfortunately, the inaccessibility of some of these films and materials renders things like ephemerality difficult for contemporary audiences to experience. But here, if we look at this flyer for a May 1984 quote-unquote all-night film gig at Ikebukuro's Bungesa Theater, we can see that in the mid-'80s in Japan, at least, this diversity was accessible. This event was one of several so-called gig screenings that Yasuda organized at Bungesa, and it featured the films Choto, Rockers, Burst City, and an 8mm documentary directed by Ota Tatsuya in 1981 titled Not Satisfied, and this featured the band Anarchy. But what these sorts of exhibition choices, which are also happening in live houses and other venues, tell us is that these films were in dialogue with one another, right? And that sort of network existed around them in terms of cross-media collaboration and consumption. And even though the environment that Burst City depicts is a completely androcentric one, other films existed that more accurately represented the makeup of Japan's punk scenes at the time, and they were screening together, right? So for this reason, it's really regrettable that of these 4 films, only Burst City has, evaded cultural and critical obscurity. And this is partly due to Yasuda's pulling Choto from exhibition to the point where, when they were promoting its 2018 digitation and screenings, a lot of the publicity used the term yomigairu, the nuances of which sort of treat the film like a living thing, right, that needs to be revived and resuscitated. And this transitoriness is really oddly fitting for a work citing punk subculture because, the cliched expression, live fast, die young, is always, bandied about when people are talking about punk. So for me, it's kind of ironic. Okay. Just quickly, this is another flyer for a similar gig event that Yasuda organized. And he told me that the first event was held at a theater that could seat about 300 people. And he said 600 people showed up at Bungeza, 600 punks, and started making a big fuss. So Bungeza had to quick open up another theater and get them in there so they could see it. And because of the success of this screening, Yasuda said it broke a one-day screening record for theaters in Japan. Bungeza let them do some other screenings. So this is like a 5-day event that Yasuda organized. And there's so many films on here that I've never heard of. And, Yasuda said he's just sitting on all this 8mm material, and maybe he'll release it, maybe he won't. So we all have to kind of wait around and see if he'll let us see some of this. It's interesting. Anyway, but because unlike materials, that simply become lost to time or material decay, Choto's ephemerality is, in part self-imposed. We can argue that it represents a form of media resistance, right? So this is perhaps comparable to the quote-unquote hardcore media resistance that David James identified in the 1980s U.S. context. James was looking at the reception, circulation, and production of hardcore punk video fanzines, and he argues that these fanzines, resist corporate assimilation because they're determined to remain, quote unquote, within the subculture. But Choto's resistance, takes its own form because it plays with disappearance. And what I find fascinating is that, unlike the resistance that, James is describing, Choto's unattainability is an obstacle that even participation in this subculture can't mitigate. Like, you cannot see this film unless Yasuda-san wants you to see it. So that makes this film really unique for me. But all right, and sometimes when I look at, the comments under Yasuda's Instagram posts, I see people around the world are begging for Choto to get released on DVD. I start to think he's toying with fans, right, who can be a little bit obsessive. I love this one on the bottom right here. Americans and people around the world want to buy A Little Rain Doesn't Matter on DVD. Please sell it. So I think, if I saw something like that, I probably wouldn't sell my DVD either. But, you get these sort of comments, and he's just sort of immune to it. But, at the same time, Yasuda is also withholding this film from domestic audiences. And since 2018, he's been sort of, parceling these screenings out in dribs and drabs. For example, the screening I went to was held in Atsugi, which takes like about 45 minutes from Shinjuku by train, so it's not exactly central. So what's interesting about Yasuda's attitude towards the film is that at the same time as he's maintaining this ephemerality, he's building up the film and sort of sustaining its legendary status and keeping it alive in the culture. And recently he posts about it on social media with frequency, and he's also sold limited edition t-shirts, you can see there, that celebrates the film's 40th anniversary, which happened this year in 2024. And granted, some of the people associated with the film recently passed away, so this press is understandable, and of course selling t-shirts helps him fund his next project. But it feels like Yasuda's sort of stoking the frenzy around, Choto as a hard-to-get film. So I'm honestly surprised he sent me a file because it was pretty risky on his part. But I would never share it. But there has been a very recent development in this film's history. Just a few weeks ago, because of this 40th anniversary of the film, there was a retrospective of Yasuda's work held at Kei's Cinema in Shinjuku, and 5 of Yasuda's extant films were screened. And this film, Far East Babies, is Yasuda's only dramatic film, and that's the one that Tohara Rie produced. And if I weren't actively teaching classes here in Michigan, I totally would have flown over to catch this because I really, really want to see that film, right? Yokoyama Sakevi, here on the left, was the singer for the band Gizm, and he was a frequent collaborator with Yasuda on films and videos, and he just recently passed away, along with some other people in Japan's punk scene. So there's sort of an element of nostalgia and an impulse toward memorialization sort of behind this recent surge of screenings for Yasuda, I think. He told me in an interview he's getting older, he's starting to think about death a bit more, so I'm wondering if we might see Choto come out on DVD soon. PPP Project recently released a selection of Gizm films and videos on DVD on the bottom right there, mostly shot by Yasuda. So I think it's possible, but this is sort of forcing a rethink for me regarding ephemerality, like about the connections between the ephemerality of material culture and the ephemerality of bodies. So just moving on, by the later 90s, punk was commodified many times over in Japan and elsewhere, and you can see that in this ad for Kanetetsu from 1983, sort of a food production company. And at the same time, digital technologies are contributing to the reemergence of older media content. So, given these circumstances, in terms of thinking about punk subculture and their mediatization, it is now possible for content to, live fast but not sort of die young. And in this, I think the 2005 dramatic film Nana, which was directed by Otani Kentaro, is apposite. The film's narrative centers on a punk band's female singer. And I'm sort of noticing lately that when you see punk bands appear in mainstream media like film or manga, there tend to be a lot of female singers, right? Or the entire band is made up of girls. So this is something that I need to start thinking about as well. But in one scene in this film, the band's guitarist wears a T-shirt that says "Too fast to live, too young to die" on it, right? And it's ironic because the film was a long-running and popular film that garnered extensive media attention for singer and actress Nakashima Mika, and it demonstrated punk's assimilation into Japan's cultural mainstream. So in this sense, Nana feels to me almost like Choto's antithesis. It has a conventional love story, like a pop-friendly narrative and high production values. So I'm not sure whether actually this film, lived fast, but it definitely didn't die young. But we can use this to also say something about diversity, right? Because this film proves that not all punk films are ephemeral, and even punks who are in the minority, like women, are not necessarily invisible. And just quickly, in closing, I just want to quick look at this manga called No Future Boy, No Future Girl by Okazaki Kyoko, and the title references lyrics by the band The Sex Pistols. But what I find really compelling about this manga is it sort of depicts a transition between a quote-unquote punk and non-punk lifestyle, right? In the narrative, Okazaki treats punk like it's kind of a youth phase. She tells a story about two people who used to be punks in the 70s. They listened to the Sex Pistols, they spiked their hair, they wore ripped up T-shirts, but now it's the 1980s and they've transitioned into a salaryman and a single mother, respectively. So they dated and broke up when they were punks, but now it's 1986 and they get back together and they reminisce. They gave punk up. No Future Boy doesn't shop for records anymore, and No Future Girl hates PIL, which is sort of the band that happened after the Sex Pistols. But I'm reading in Okazaki's words and images here a critique of both punk's commodification and also sort of the social norm of growing out of subcultural participation. Jack Halberstam has read this becoming adult process as heteronormative, but it also resonates with the practice common in 1980s Japan of graduating or sotsugyō suru from certain types of fandom once one reaches a supposed maturity, like idol fandom. So in this sense, Okazaki's manga take on punk in 70s to 80s Japan sort of also touches on ephemerality, but here the issue is less about access to content and more about, the ways punk was being lived or not in this context. So we can see by looking at Okazaki's work that these debates surrounding punk, images, and everyday lives extend across media and genres in this moment as well. So just to close, I want to stress that I don't want to say that every documentary film or creative work that engages punk in this context represents a space of inclusion, right? Nor am I claiming that problematic moments are completely absent from this text. So we can look at the 1985 concert video Hata o Kakagero, or Raise the Flag, which is a documentary drama hybrid featuring the band Anarchy, and it was directed by a very early career Sai Yoichi, so that might surprise some of you. In several narrative scenes in the video, a female actor appears toting a film camera, and she goes about the motions of filming the band. First, she appears wearing a Nazi uniform, and then she later takes all of her clothes off and dances around provocatively with the band members. So the band singer eventually just takes the camera away from her and starts filming her naked body in close-up. So to me, these scenes are disappointing in that, what could have been a meta-cinematic gesture, citing gender-diverse filmmaking, just becomes an exercise in sexualization and spectacle. And I want to say, shame on you, Sai Yoichi, but I don't really know the production history behind the video, so I'll just reserve judgment for now. But so in some of these films and videos and in some of the song lyrics themselves, we can find questionable things. So I just want to make sure that I point that out. And another important point is I'm not finding a lot of overt feminism in the works that I'm looking at. I would love to find it, but right now I'm just not seeing it. And the possible exception to that might be Change 2000, because it really looks like they want to support female production and creativity. So what I hope you take away from my talk today is that there's a wealth of material out there that challenges conceptions of what quote-unquote punk media and performance in 70s to 80s Japan look and sound like, and that pushes back against the lines that we all tend to draw around punk cultures and lifestyles. And there are scholars and practitioners out there who are working to sponsor a more inclusive dialogue about punk filmmaking and images, for example, Rachel Garfield, but we really need more of this in scholarship on Japan. And personally, I'd like to look more into not only gender, but also transnational connections and media flows between punk cultures in Japan and the United States. For me, these are the kinds of conversations that we really need to be having. So I'll just leave it there since time's running short. So thank you. Thank you for listening. Oh, thank you.
Yes.
I don't know how to use these things. Well, hi, everybody. Thanks for staying. There is time for questions and answers. We've got about 20 minutes, 15, 17 minutes. I've got a couple questions online, but I'd like to start with the audience here. Is there any questions from the audience or comments? Yes, dear.
Thank you for introducing and digging up the very, very underground Japanese subculture, counterculture at the time. I said, that today the subculture is not sub, but almost main culture. But at this period, subculture is sub and underground and counter for against the mainstream. So, today's topic is my generation's movement. So I want to ask you, I recognize the movement of the punk culture in late 70s and early 80s. It's have some influence from the, for instance, the American culture. Some of the filmmakers of the period, including Ishii Sōgo, who is my same age, very strongly influenced from the American movement. For instance, the Kenneth Anger, Stan Brakhage, and Jonas Mekas. And the 8mm filmmaking movement moved to some country of Asia, especially Japan and the Philippines. So I recognize that some of the punk movement in Japan is very strongly from the American culture at that same period. And one more comment about the same period in Japan. There are also, on the other hand, different kind of the new culture, like very easy listening music. For instance, Yumin and some other people. Yumin, you can understand some songs in the Ghibli films. And also the same period, for instance, the Yellow Magic Orchestra was coming with Ryuichi Sakamoto and some members. Their music is not like punk, and very, very cool and calm, and in the sense of the anti-humanistic but electric tones. So I recognize at that time that this movement, I know the punk culture is merely a struggle and anti-mainstream culture. But yeah, I can find very, very new matters today. So I want to ask you how do you think the uniqueness of the punk culture in Japan compared with the American movement and this Japanese mainstream at the same time? すいません、同世代なもんで、パンカルチャーも知ってましたけども、一個アメリカの映画、8ミリ映画の影響なんかも感じたし、一方で当時の日本って高度成長とバブル経済に入る頃ですごい口当たりのいい音楽とか電子音楽 YMO とかが出てきた頃で、それの対抗カルチャーとして当時は見てたような気がするんですけど、そこがすごくユニークだっておっしゃるその理由を教えてください。
Thank you for that. There's so much in that question. First of all, I try not to use like the word unique as much as I can. But punk in Japan is a really interesting example because I'm reading a lot about subcultures in the 80s, and I read Otsuka Eiji, and he sort of talks about how as we move into the 80s it's less mainstream and counterculture and more of a fracturing right out into many different subcultures that you could join. So I'm thinking punk in one way is part of that, but in a way there's still sort of that inherited impulse to be against some sort of main thing, right? Some sort of main culture. But in a lot of the cases that I'm seeing, punk quickly, even though might start out that way, quickly develops less as sort of a reaction to something outside of itself, but more of sort of something, a way to seek something for yourself, right? A way to stand out, a way to perform differently, a way to live differently, just having interest in sort of, going to the shows and dressing. So I see less of a political push, in this movement as well. There was this interview with a member of the band Gaze in the magazine Maximum Rock and Roll, and this band member says, in English, punk means rebellion, but for us in Japan, it means self-responsibility. So it's about, living your everyday life and being responsible for what you do. So there is a little bit of a politicalness there, but for this particular band, they're not sort of reacting against something. They're sort of, being political in their everyday. So I think that's interesting. But, you can't dodge the fact that influence from New York, influence from, London and places like that came in and, inspired this movement, which is why you see a lot of the videos and stuff being from these places. So there is inspiration from outside, but, what happens after is sort of more what I'm interested in. And there are Japanese musicians, like there were two musicians, Rek and Chiko Hige, who went to New York in the 70s and sort of participated in, I guess, what they call no-wave bands, like Teenage Jesus and the Jerks. So they were active in New York cultures, and as we saw, there are photographers, musicians, journalists, all these people flowing into London and New York just to see what's going on and, bringing back what they do. So I try to point out that there's a flow going both ways. It might be a little imbalanced, but I'm trying to find places where the flow is going back and forth. And mainland Asia would be great to find some, synergies there too. I'd love to find something like that.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you. We have a question online. Really great talk.
Oh, thank you.
Are there any other women from the time when you, from that time, that you are able to connect with and engage with?
From Japan? Okay. Well, one thing that I found that I was really excited about, and I wanted to skip this because we went over, is I saw the film Guerriere Talks. I'm sorry, my French is not very good. Directed by Vivian Dick in 1978. And I was really excited because the artist and, percussionist Mori Ikue appears in this film. And it's a documentary, and Mori Ikue came over from Japan in 1977 to New York and just immediately joined a band called DNA and became their drummer, even though she had no musical, history whatsoever. She had been in art school. And I love this section of this film because Mori-san is so shy and so uncomfortable being screened that her impulse is to pick up her own, photographic camera and just sort of challenge Vivian Dick with her own image making. So she's, photographing back. So I contacted Mori Ikue and I said, hey, were you doing photography? Were you making films? Were there any other women from Japan or anybody from Japan in New York making films at this time? And she kind of said, no, I don't really do visual work. But I know she went to art school, so I think she probably secretly did. But she kind of said, I don't think I saw any of those people, and it was a long time ago, and I forget. So it was kind of a dead end. But, I'm still looking out for these people. And, they're not in the majority, so it's hard to find them. But, I'm looking for these places where, women are really contributing to the visual archive. So that's one example.
Other questions from this group? I have two more questions from online. Yes, please.
Thank you for a great talk. We're going to talk about this more later. But my question...
Sounds threatening.
Yes. No, I just want to pick your brain about it because it's so interesting.
Yeah.
My question is about geography. You kind of mentioned, specific spaces in which, the screenings happen. Sometimes it's far from central Tokyo. But I'm also curious, what kind of geography is being kind of depicted in these kind of films that you're looking at? Because if, punk aesthetic is somehow a subcultural alternative to the mainstream, I'm curious how then, is it very still Tokyo-centric in the way it's depicted, or how is that kind of mainstream versus subculture kind of dynamic then being played out kind of geographically in the films itself, but also kind of through its kind of screenings and kind of broader punk practices?
Great, that's a great question. Thank you. Most of these films are shot in Tokyo, and I need to try to get down to Osaka and see what's going on there. But it's a very urban phenomenon because you need to be connected to these screening spaces, right? You have to go, and a lot of times they're in the live houses, so you need a variety of places to screen these films. So I'm seeing mainly, urban spaces. And one of the cool things about Chotto as a film is that the filmmakers let the interview subjects choose where they wanted to be filmed. So sometimes you see someone sitting in a harbor, one person's laying in bed, one person's walking down the street, he refuses to stop, or you get someone, just in a crappy backstage corner. So you get to see all these spaces that they pick, and they're not all really cool clubs or anything like that. They're just spaces that people connect to, which I think is pretty cool. And there's this music historian, Namekawa Kazuhiko, and he talks about how, hardcore punk in the 80s in Japan was kind of invisible, but at the same time it was really visible because this club Yaneura was right in the heart of hip Shibuya. So it's just right there. And he talked about how there was an Arby's, which was Arby's was the new cool fast food restaurant that came from America, and it was literally across the street from this club Yaneura. So you'd see these school kids who are very mainstream listening to idol music, just running around, but then you'd see these punks with these mohawks and chains. So he's like, it was a really weird space. So there's mixing, right? And they're out there. And I showed you the ad for Kane Tetsu. So people are aware because they stand out, right? And they want to. A lot of the punks use the term meidatsu, right? I want to stand out. I want to get noticed. So it's something they're very aware of. And there's kind of a fashion aspect to it. And there's just kind of I just want to be different and not explaining necessarily why politically. But most of it I would say would be urban, but finding something in more rural spaces would be great, but I haven't as of yet.
I have another question from online. I'm going to just summarize. Really the main idea in this question is, did this women involved in the punk rocker movement have any influence in the women's movement in Japan as far as you can tell?
Well, not on, the early women's lib movement, because that sort of blew up in the early 70s before punk even came around and sort of fizzled out a little bit. And then it sort of transitioned into more sort of like activism aimed at changing policy on the policy level and a little more academic. So, sort of the women's lib boom was self-generative and didn't have anything to do with punk, because punk came later. But it's not that there might not have been synergies, but I'm really not seeing that other than
that's what you had said. I'm just not seeing it.
Yeah, I really want to find it. Yeah.
That one zine. And one last question, not rebellious, but self-responsibility. Can you say more about that, please?
Okay, well, yeah, this was like an interview in a magazine, so they didn't really elaborate on that, but it was just kind of this band member wanted to explain, like, there's all these political groups in England and New York, and they're very against, anti-authoritarian, but in Japan, this group is saying that, we're not really playing against something, we're just, experimenting, but if we have a politics, it's very much on the level of the everyday. We react to things that are happening to us personally. So it's not that they play their music to be political, but they, and I'm not exactly sure why self-responsibility. Sure. It was just this person's sort of statement, but I think it has something to do with wanting to distinguish sort of a stereotype of punk with, how they're actually performing it and living it in their particular group, I think.
Yes.
Oh.
We have a couple more minutes.
Thank you for the really interesting talk with a lot of different tendrils. I know that you said that you're not really interested in playing with definitions, and because it feels reifying, but I find it really interesting that in a lot of the ephemeral materials that you showed us, it seems to me like the people engaging in punk culture are using that word, putting films underneath it and playing a game of articulating what it is or what it means. And so I'm wondering what is the, not what is, but where does the dominant narrative of what punk is come from? Where has it come from? I'm guessing it hasn't come from those early materials that you found. Maybe it came, so like where does that dominant narrative come from? And can your archival work or your archaeological work in recovering these early self-definitions from various places contribute to that definition? Even,
So
that's how I see it.
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, originally they're getting material from, England and New York, like Patti Smith's coming in and the Sex Pistols are coming in. So they're getting, other cultures' ideas of what punk are, but then they're reinterpreting it for themselves. So one of the interesting things in Choto is, one of the female musicians, Hidemaru, is interviewed and she says, I don't really identify with being a punk anymore. Like, I don't care about it, and I like to stand out, but right now it just feels like a hobby to me. So it seems like, if they latched on to some stereotypical politics or aesthetics, they quickly got rid of it and just started doing their own thing. So I mean, you have to have a subculture, you need some sort of a base level word, right? So like otaku or something like that you can sort of aggregate around, especially if you're going to advertise shows and stuff. You need to get people to come, so you have to say, okay, this is punk. But then when you get within it, there's so much diversity. Like way different bands than you would expect. And I think it just became, the way I like to look at punk is as a lived subculture. So I'm just kind of letting people self-define as much as they can and sort of set out their own parameters about what they think punk is and how they fit into it. So, I'm trying to avoid the definition, but what punk is and how people feel about punk is basically the whole framework of the film Choto. So there's so many different interpretations just within this one film.
Well, thank you for your avid participation. Thank you very much for a
Thank you.
stimulating talk. See you all soon.